All right. So now we're on the next section in Ken Wilber's book, Up from Eden here, which is entitled Tales of Dim Eden. And of course, by dim Eden, he means the early history of the hominids prior to the advent of Homo sapiens. And then we have this first section here called the mysterious serpent, which is a term, he calls it the Ouroboros. The Ouroboros is the world-encircling serpent in ancient mythology that he has taken from Erich Neumann's book, The Origins and History of Consciousness. And so his first level on his Great Chain of Being, and I realized, I've read later books of Ken Wilber, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. I've read that. I think it's a disastrous book. So I'm aware of the later books and how his model changes over time. It never gets any better. I think it gets worse, actually. But here he's got nature as the first level, which he equates with Jean Gebser's archaic consciousness structure, which includes, for him, physical nature and lower life forms. It's plurimatic, material, and Ouroboros reptilian. And I think the problem is, and I think this chapter, by the way, is a disaster. I don't think that, I think the archaic Ouroboros that he uses here ends up becoming kind of catch-all, into which he can dump everything that he doesn't want to take the time to sit down and study, the previous phases of evolution that not only hominids have gone through, but also the entire planet, the entire history of life on the planet. I think there's a problem here, too, with Gebser. I know Gebser's only interested in the evolution of human culture, but I never really thought that his archaic consciousness structure, which is the first of his structures, followed by the magical, the mythical, the mental, and so forth, was very clear, and it seemed to me very vague. And he says that it just refers to the primal undifferentiated unity, where there is no differentiation between self and the rest of the world, and most likely that refers to the hominids prior to Homo sapiens. Well, I think that's a flaw with Gebser, and I think that Gebser's model could have benefited by going back through the history of evolution and looking at the possibility that the archaic isn't just a catch-all for all consciousness prior to Homo sapiens, but actually has a lot of different structures of consciousness that have come along. I think there's a reptilian consciousness structure, a mammalian consciousness structure, an arthropodic consciousness structure, and so forth. And so what I'd like to do, actually, is to go back through the history of evolution and look at the various geological epochs and what was going on in each of these epochs, to think a little bit about what has led up to the advent of Homo sapien consciousness. It didn't come out of nowhere. So we have the Earth forming, the Hadean Epoch, about 4.6 billion years ago, which lasts until 4 billion years ago, so about half a billion years, in which the Earth is forming with a sort of olivine crust and anorthite crystals, all these primordial elements that are compacting, dunite pyroxene crystals that are compacting into black basalt, and then later granite forms out of all this. So the Earth is forming its exoskeleton, its mineralogical being there-ness. Meteorites come and they bring water, because inside these meteorites, as they're impacting the Earth, are little frozen ice crystals that apparently there's so many of them over time, they just create little pools that coalesce, and pretty soon there's an ocean. And so the stage is set by the end of the Hadean Epoch for the Archean, which begins about 4 billion years ago and lasts for about until about 2.5 billion years ago. And it's during the Archean that then, once the stage is set, life can now appear. As Thales said, everything comes out of water. And as our scientific accounts say, all life has emerged out of the sea. And so that's exactly what happens. We get the first microbes that are existing during this epoch. And there seems to be two types of them, and there might have been strife between them. And indeed, as we look through the history of evolution, pretty much all we see is strife between organisms with differing consciousness structures that rub up against each other and vie for mastery over the stage of the Earth. First, we have the fermenting bacteria, which come in possibly out of deep thermal depths. Maybe they've come out of amino acids that have come from meteorites, perhaps, bringing amino acids, impacting the water with lightning mixing into this primal soup, and coming out of deep thermal vents in the depths of the oceans. But they only handle methane and hydrogen and things like that. There's a second generation of bacteria, the photosynthetic cyanobacteria, which are a bit more advanced and sophisticated and interesting because they respire they like sunlight, they harness it, and they bring down CO2 in order to use it as energy for the photosynthetic process. So CO2 is coming down out of the atmosphere. There's not much oxygen there yet. The sky is a kind of rusty red-brown, which they gradually stain with oxygen as it is released as a byproduct of the photosynthetic process. So oxygen gets released, the sky becomes blue, and the temperature starts dropping because CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and they're pulling it down. They're doing the opposite of what we're doing. We're putting CO2 up there. They're pulling it down, so the temperatures are going to drop. And these cyanobacteria, by the way, are incredibly creative beings here. They create these structures called stromatolites. And stromatolites are like bacterial cosmopolises. They're these huge to them. For us, they're about 3 foot tall structures at the edge of the shores. Structures in which there are all kinds of things are going on with these bacteria. They're building these megalopolitan structures for themselves. I like to think of them as bacterial ziggurats. And so they're doing all of this, but then eventually they bring on the first ice age, and that ends the Archean Epoch. Each one of these epochs ends with some kind of catastrophe that marks a threshold of some kind. So we have the oxygen catastrophe. Basically, oxygen is a poison. It kills living things. It has an effect on iron and creates rust and red thing. So after a while, we get the Proterozoic epoch, in which we get a new type of bacteria that is aerobic bacteria that can handle that oxygen and take it out of the atmosphere and harness it and do it, and it gives them a lot of energy, and they puncture the membranes of these previous cyanobacteria, dissolve them like viruses do. There are no viruses yet, I don't think. And so there's a process that occurs here in which the earlier elements get taken up to become part of the cellular architecture of protists. Larger nucleated cells, organisms with nucleated cells now, possibly as defense mechanisms. You build a wall, just as we do later on with cities. You build a wall around the precious goods, whether it's wheat, whatever kind of wealth you have, to keep out the invaders, and that seems to be what the nucleus was, with the invention of protists to defend against these violent aerobic bacteria constantly puncturing their membranes. But they get taken up and become part of the architectural structure. They later become mitochondria. Mitochondria then harness in animal cells oxygen respiration, and chloroplasts in plant cells handle photosynthesis, which the cyanobacteria get taken up into to become. And so this is all going on, and we get in the Proterozoic these two different types of algae, blue-green algae and red algae. And the blue-green algae seems to also becomes creative, like the previous generation had done with the stromatolites, only this time they form these horizontal mats, these microbial mats at the edges of oceans and water lines, with these yellow runnels between them, dividing them. And they're like gigantic microbial cities, only horizontal this time instead of vertical. And their rivals, meantime, are red algae, which form in the oceans near the shores, little red polyps that begin to form like these surrealist works of art. And they start staining the edges of rivers and valleys red. And then viruses are now coming in. So viruses are a problem at this point. They just pop up and they start assaulting everyone. So new defense mechanisms have to be built against them. Once again, though, the balance of oxygen in relation to methane, and this time in the atmosphere, causes another ice age, this time one quite a bit more severe than the first one, and it encompasses the entire Earth in a frozen white ball. This is known to geologists now as the White Earth, and it was the worst ice age we've ever had. The entire planet was locked inside of ice. And so then, as the Cambrian period comes on, about 541 million years ago, down to 485, eventually volcanoes start melting this. They just start thermally popping up. The ice melts, and it retreats. And after that, deep in the oceans, we start getting the first multi-celled living organisms, these little guys. There's a whole bunch of them. They're wild and crazy. I highly invite you to go look at them, these little organisms that are all the size of your thumb. They fit neatly in the palm of your hand, and they're wild. There's all kinds of creatures. We have waxia and the first trilobites. The first fish now come in, which is significant. Pikaia gracilis comes in, which is a primitive fish with a primitive notochord, gills, and it's already up and running, this little guy. And the only giant one was the Anomalocaris, which is 3 foot long, and was just going on. It looks like it was built specifically to eat trilobites. So already note there that with the Cambrian explosion of animal life forms, we already have this division between vertebrates with a notochord that eventually evolves into a spine with these fishes and arthropods with exoskeletons. So evolution is going to play out for a while, for quite a while now, from the Cambrian down to the Carboniferous, as a war between the arthropods, exoskeletal beings, and the vertebrates, endoskeletal beings. There's going to be contention and strife for a long, long time between these two. So that's the Cambrian, basically, and then we get the Ordovician, which lasts from 485 million to about 443 million. And the Ordovician is characterized by fish now are jawless still. We have Erndaspids. They're jawless fish that go sucking along the bottom of the seas. And we get these, the predators now become cephalopods, very large squids that go along eating everything and everyone up. And we start to get these sea scorpions now. And these are the arthropods now achieving dominance during this epoch, the Ordovician. We start getting giant scorpions that have gills and can breathe underwater, and they start attacking everything. So that by the time of the Silurian epoch, 443 million years to 419 million years, the giant sea scorpions, and they're huge. They're mega scorpions. They're the biggest predators, and they're gobbling everything up, especially all the fish, which are still no larger than the size of the palm of your hand, and they're jawless. Until at some point in the Silurian, I think maybe the fish got tired of this. And what they did was they took a gill bone, they brought it forward and transformed it into a three-piece jawbone with three bones, and they invented this hinged thing, the jawbone, that can move up and down and grab and bite prey, chomp it up, and swallow it. And that was a turning point for the vertebrate line that we came out of. Without the jaw, we wouldn't be here. So these clever little guys, and you have to wonder, how did they figure this out? How did they figure out how to take one of their bones and turn it into something that was an evolutionary advantage? Because by the time we get to the Devonian period, now we've got huge fish, Dunkleosteus. Look that monster up. It has a huge jaw that just goes along chomping up other fish. And so now the fish begin to get bigger and bigger and bigger and start gigantifying and intimidating the arthropods. And so now the fish start, with that evolutionary innovation, they start to gain the upper hand during this period. And so it's during the Devonian that life starts coming on land, migrating on land bit by bit, and trees start building themselves up with lignin, and they start getting larger and larger until by the time we get to there's a huge catastrophe, by the way. With the Devonian, there's an apocalyptic catastrophe of volcanic eruptions going on all over the planet. The ocean's boiling, all these crazy fish world colonies. And I'd love to know what the structure of consciousness of these fish was. They get boiled up and most of them get killed, and it's quite an apocalypse. And then after all of that, the dust settles on that about 358 to 298 million years ago, we get the Carboniferous. And the Carboniferous is now characterized by enclosing canopies of jungles. Everywhere you look, you have jungles. And the arthropods now respond to the previous dominance of the fish by gigantifying. So we begin to get huge insects that are on land now, working their way through these jungles, gigantic millipedes, centipedes, 3-foot large scorpions the size of dogs, gigantic dragonflies come in, and the arthropods are really quite formidable during this time. But now we are starting to get the first reptiles that are coming in during the Carboniferous. And the Carboniferous, of course, is called that because that's where we get all our fossil fuels from, all these dense forests. And we start getting the first snakes, and we start getting these reptiles now coming in response, perhaps, to the gigantification of these insect beings, which may have been so large because oxygen concentrations were higher at that point, so it might have powered them. There were a lot of fires going on. When you raise oxygen above 21% concentration in the atmosphere, you have a tendency to get fires. And so there were a lot of burning. You can imagine these forests like an apocalypse now, sort of jungle with fires always burning in the background somewhere. And so life is up and thriving and flourishing, and the struggle between the vertebrates and the arthropods continues during this period. Then we get the Permian, the famous Permian, because it ends, of course, with the biggest catastrophe life has ever seen. 99% of all life was wiped out during the Permian. So it's a wonder we're even here. And during the Permian, the reptiles are getting larger and larger, and they're starting to look like dinosaur-type beings. We get these lystrosaurs. They're tetrapods. Almost all of them are tetrapods. wandering around, eating things. They have giant predators which eat them. But we begin to get now, during the Permian, this innovation of the first mammal-like reptiles, like Thrinaxodon. And Thrinaxodon has whiskers, fangs, and is giving live birth to its young, even though it's kind of reptilian still, but it's giving live birth to its young. And this thing is the key to the future. The apocalypse happens. Apparently this, again, was massive volcanic eruptions, and this brings the Permian to an apocalyptic close. I've written, by the way, about all of this in my book, Archean, which is a poetic version of all this, the history of the Earth in poetic form. So that's available on Amazon if anyone's interested. But the Permian ends with another apocalypse, then we shift into the Triassic, of course, Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. 251 million years ago, down to the extinction of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. And in the Triassic, all kinds of new reptilian beings come in, and they predominate now, and the arthropods begin to fade away. They fade away they begin to miniaturize into roaches, and then flies come in, and spiders, all these little miniaturizations of arthropods, crabs walking along. The gigantic arthropods now of the Carboniferous are gone. They've lost out. The reptiles are now gigantifying. They're on land. They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We've got a lot of upright walking raptor-like creatures that are running around ripping each other apart. Then there's another catastrophe. Each one of these epochs ends with a catastrophe, almost invariably, of one magnitude or another. We get to the Jurassic. We start getting the classic dinosaurs in the Jurassic, Stegosaurus, and all these guys. And then finally, with the Cretaceous, we get the gigantification of the dinosaurs. Flowers come into being. Grass is invented now. Everything is beginning to change until an asteroid hits, wipes all of this out. That's it for the gigantification of the reptiles. But they won against the arthropods, I think. And then, so now we have the Paleocene, 66 to 56 million years ago, in which mammals start flourishing, coming into being. And during this time, by the way, the world's largest snake that we ever know of, called Titanoboa, is existing during this period. And this thing is so large, it's eating crocodiles for breakfast. It's gigantic. But mammals are coming in. As the stage is cleared now, the gigantic reptiles are gone, mammals are getting larger and larger, and then by the time of the Oligocene, one of my favorite epochs here because mammals get crazy and large, gigantic. The Oligocene is the mammalian response to the reptilian response of the Cretaceous. It's a gigantification period. We get rhinoceroses called Indricotherium that are 20 feet high. They're huge. Look these guys up. They're amazing. Chalcotherium comes in. These are giant, weird sloths with heads that look like horses, and all they do is sit and eat like sloths do, trees and branches and leaves, but they're huge and bizarre looking. They look like something made up as a character in mythology. We get these bizarre entelodonts, which are pigs that are carnivorous, with not just fangs and snouts, but the whole thing, and they hunt in packs like wolves. Very bizarre. And the world's largest shark, the megalodon, dates from this period, a gigantic shark. Everything's getting big, large, and giant during the Oligocene period, which lasts from 33 million years ago to 23 million years ago. So out of all of this, there are so many structures of consciousness in there. It would be wonderful to know them and for someone to go in and map them out and say what they are. All of this just gets dumped into Gebser's and Wilber's archaic consciousness structure, but there's so much going on here. And later, eventually, of course, around 5 to 7 million years ago, we start getting the process. And monkeys first appeared, by the way, in the Eocene. They start chattering in the trees during the Eocene. Gadanosha is this primal sort of monkey. And during the Eocene also, we also get the first horses, and they're these little tiny creatures called Propaleotheriums. And they eventually evolve into horses. So we have monkeys and horses during that period. So the Oligocene, finally we move to the hominization process where we start getting the Australopithecines coming into being as far as we know. They didn't have language or tools or symbolism or art. As far as we know, nothing has been found on them. So we're coming down the line 5 million years ago, and then we come down to about 2 million years ago, and we start getting these new guys called Homo habilis. Now, Homo habilis was most certainly a conceptually thinking creature. Anthropologists won't tell you this. Wilber doesn't seem to think this, but I've studied this. In Homo habilis, they're not only building tools with the old Darwin tool industries, this is all in Africa, but they're building the first wall. There's evidence of a wall. They're using red ochre. They're collecting shiny pebbles and stones that are attractive and interesting. And if these guys are making tools, they can talk, because language is part of the same part of the brain that is involved in tool making. Look that up, because it's a fact. So language must be pushed back at least as far as Homo habilis. So Homo habilis must have had its own consciousness structure, and then after it, about 1.5 million years, comes Homo erectus, which is making more advanced tools, Acheulean hand axes, which are beautiful. This guy was concerned that these things should be beautiful. So the brain's getting larger, this cranial capacity is getting larger, more conceptual thinking is coming in. So we have, and these guys are also the first, as far as we know, to build huts and grass houses and structures, as has been found on the shores at Nice in France. So these guys, and they may have been rivals, Homo erectus rubbing up against Homo habilis and possibly causing them to become extinct. I think there's a reason why between humans there's nothing else evolutionarily similar down to chimps and gorillas. There's a reason for that. There's been a continual genocidal racial structure and struggle, going on for a long, long time, I think, between all of these guys. And then finally, eventually we get down to the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnons, which I've talked about in other discussions. Clearly, I think the Cro-Magnons come into Europe 40,000 BC. The Neanderthals are extinct by 27,000 BC. That's not an accident. There has been a genocidal, ethnic cleansing race war going on here. And I think this has been going on probably all along. Life is contention and strife, as we have seen, going right down the line. And I think there's a different consciousness structure. There's a reptilian consciousness structure, a mammalian consciousness structure, an arthropodic consciousness structure, a Homo habilis consciousness structure, a consciousness structure for Homo erectus, for Neanderthals, and Cro-Magnon man. And all these latter guys, these hominid guys, had conceptual thinking, language, symbolism, and tools. There's no doubt about that. So, Wilber, failing to study all of this and look at, because he doesn't like concrete things, he doesn't like looking at facts and specific concrete things, he only likes concepts. And so the only things that he moves around in his head are these concepts. The physical world doesn't exist for him. He's not interested in it. Hegel suffered from the same problem. And this is not to equate Hegel with Wilber by saying that they had the same conceptual problem, because Hegel was a genuinely great thinker, and I think Wilber is mediocre at best. So this winds it down. This is the archaic Ouroboros consciousness structure, which needs to be divided up into actual concrete study and interaction with paleoanthropology, with the history of geology, paleontology. Things like that need to be consulted and looked at in order to make sense out of all these substages of the so-called archaic consciousness structure. And so that's pretty much my critique of this chapter. The second half of it, it goes into this thing about the Kundalini Yoga being essentially equivalent to the same thing that he's talking about this. And I'm fascinated with Kundalini Yoga because I think it's interesting. It does sort of recapitulate in miniature, as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, the awakening of consciousness, as you begin with the Muladhara chakra at the bottom of the spine, where the anus is. Basically, that's the lowest chakra. It's associated with dense materiality. And I think it's also possible to line the planets of astrology up. Wilber doesn't know this because he didn't study astrology, like he didn't study a lot of things. That the planets in astrology correspond pretty much in sense and symbolism to the chakras. Saturn, the heaviest, darkest planet associated with materiality, restriction, constriction. Saturn always gets in the way of everything. Corresponds pretty much to the Muladhara chakra. And then moving up to the genitals, we get the chakra of pleasure that corresponds to Venus. This is the zone of Venus. And then moving up from there to the gut, the lower intestinal, what in the Japanese world is called the hara, the center of your being, but it's a contentional center that has to do with conflict, aggression, and strife. That's Mars, of course. And then moving up to the heart chakra, this is where compassion begins to open up. The animal emotions start open up, and you start thinking about other people. Other people are hurting too, and so you start to feel compassion for them. This could perhaps correspond to Jupiter. It sounds a little more like Venus, but without the erotic aspect. Maybe Jupiter would slot in there very well with his beneficent, kingly aspect, who's concerned for the wealth and well-being of all, perhaps. But at the throat chakra, I think it's the Vishuddha chakra, if I remember that right, that we start getting into conceptual thinking. This starts becoming the voice articulating. This is Mercury, the planet that's associated with the lower intellect. And then we move up between the eyes to the Agya chakra, and at the top of the head to the Sahasrara chakra, which is the 1,000-petaled lotus. These top two, I think, correspond to Neptune. Those are Neptunian spiritual aspects and emotions. And so there is indeed a gradual opening and awakening of consciousness as we move up the Kundalini that is somewhat similar. And I think Jung wrote about this in his lecture on the Kundalini, where he talks about the Kundalini being similar, as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, to the gradual awakening of consciousness throughout this evolutionary contention and strife that we have just looked at. And so I think there's a lot more going on than Ken Wilber, at least in this book. And I know it's an early book, but I don't think he gets any better. I've read the later stuff, and actually I kind of dislike it more than this. So anyways, we'll leave it there for that, the chapter on the Ouroboros Archaic, and next move on to the Tophonic Magical.